I had just moved into the neighborhood, seeking a fresh start after years of living in the hustle and bustle of the city. The thought of wide, tree lined streets, friendly neighbors, and the quiet suburban life sounded perfect to me. What I didn't anticipate, though, was the presence of one particular person, Karen, the neighborhood's HOA president. Karen wasn't just any HOA president, she was a self appointed queen of the cul de sac, and the moment she knocked on my door, I could sense that. I opened it, expecting a simple hello or maybe a friendly introduction. Instead, I was greeted by a woman with a clipboard in hand, wearing a bright red cardigan, and her smile could only be described as too perfect. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, her tone dripping with faux warmth. "I'm Karen, and I'm here to help you get settled in, but there are a few things we need to discuss first." She thrust the clipboard toward me before I could even say a word. "First of all, we have strict rules about lawn maintenance here. You'll want to make sure your grass is mowed every Saturday morning by 8 a.m. sharp. Not a blade of grass out of place, or you'll be fined." I blinked. "I just got here this morning." She didn't flinch. "Oh, well, of course, but just so you know, we like to keep things neat and tidy around here. You'll also need to make sure your driveway is free of any vehicles after 10 p.m. No exceptions." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, but who enforces these rules?" "I do," she said proudly, tapping the clipboard with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And I don't tolerate anything less than perfection. If you need any help, I'll be around. Don't hesitate to call me." The whole thing felt off, but I nodded politely despite my growing irritation. It was only a few days into living here, and already Karen was making it clear that she would be keeping a very close eye on me. I wasn't about to let her push me around, but for now, I figured I'd keep my head down and play nice. That lasted all of 2 days. The next morning, as I was carrying groceries into my house, I saw Karen walking up my driveway again. This time, her eyes darted around, inspecting everything with the precision of a detective. She walked right up to my freshly planted garden, a patch of bright tulips and daffodils. I hadn't even realized they were against the rules until she pointed it out. "You didn't clear this with me first," she said, frowning. "You're not allowed to plant anything without HOA approval. This needs to be removed immediately." I was stunned. "What? It's just flowers. It's not like I put in a fountain or anything." She crossed her arms, glaring at me. "You can't just do whatever you want here. There are rules, and they apply to everyone." Her words didn't just sting. They felt like an attack. I didn't come here to be micromanaged. The longer she stood there, inspecting every inch of my property, the more I realized I had to do something about it. I didn't care about flowers or driveways or any of her other petty rules, but I wouldn't be pushed around by someone who seemed to think she ran the entire neighborhood. I had lived in too many places where people tried to control every little thing to let her make me her target. That afternoon, I decided to take a stand. But first, I needed more information. So I started keeping track of every interaction I had with Karen, her visits, her complaints, everything. I'd never dealt with an HOA before, but I quickly learned that they had no right to overstep their bounds. Armed with knowledge and a deep sense of stubbornness, I was ready to face her again. And when I did, it would be on my terms. As the days passed, Karen's presence became an even bigger part of my life than I had anticipated. She showed up at my doorstep nearly every other day, pointing out some tiny infraction she claimed I had committed. My lawn wasn't perfect enough. I hadn't trimmed the edges to her exacting standards. The trash bins were a little too visible, and she complained about my recycling bin being slightly overfilled on the wrong day. It was always something. At first, I tried to brush it off. I didn't want to make waves in a new neighborhood. I figured if I just let it slide, I could keep things peaceful. But Karen didn't take the hint. Instead, she ramped up her efforts to control every aspect of my life, using the HOA rules as her weapon. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon. I had just finished raking the leaves that had fallen from the oak tree in my yard when I heard her familiar high heels clicking on the pavement. I turned around to find her standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, looking almost pleased with herself. "Your lawn needs attention," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The grass isn't quite as green as it should be." I stared at her. The grass had just been freshly mowed a few days ago. And while the rain had caused a few blades to lean a little sideways, it was hardly a crisis. Still, she was undeterred. Also, I noticed you've got a bit of mulch over here, she continued, pointing toward the flower bed I had worked so hard to maintain. That's not allowed without permission, and it's too close to the sidewalk. People might trip. I narrowed my eyes, taking a slow breath to steady myself. It's mulch. It's safe. No one's gonna trip. Karen crossed her arms, giving me a pitying look as if I were a child who didn't understand basic yard work. I'm afraid that's not up for discussion. You've been warned. I clenched my jaw. The audacity of this woman was incredible. But instead of getting angry, I smiled thinly and said, "You know what? I think I've had enough of this." Karen blinked, clearly caught off guard by my calm response. "What do you mean by that?" I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "I've been letting you push me around because I thought it was easier. But I'm done. You can't control everything, Karen. Not anymore." She seemed to regain her composure and smiled as if I were just another rebellious neighbor who would eventually fall in line. "Well, we'll see about that." It was in that moment I realized something important. I had to change my approach. I wasn't going to fight Karen with anger or resistance. I was going to outsmart her. I would use her own rules against her. That night, I started to gather every piece of information I could find about HOA regulations, everything from bylaws to the community guidelines she had mentioned so often. I spent hours reading, highlighting, and cross-referencing, memorizing the tiniest details of her power and authority. I wasn't going to let Karen have her way anymore. By the time I was done, I had a stack of papers and a new sense of determination. But I needed one more thing: leverage. I needed to find a way to expose Karen's own mistakes. She had been too focused on trying to control me. Now I was going to turn the tables. The next day, I decided to attend the HOA board meeting that Karen had arranged. I hadn't been interested in the HOA politics before, but now I saw it as the perfect opportunity to make my move. I walked into the meeting with my binder full of research, ready to expose the flaws in the system she had worked so hard to build. Karen, sitting at the head of the table, gave me a thin smile when I walked in. "Nice to see you've decided to join us," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't acknowledge her comment. Instead, I placed the binder on the table with a quiet thud. "I think it's time we had a real conversation about the rules around here," I said calmly. Karen's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I opened the binder and began going through the bylaws. "Well, for starters, you've been fining people for infractions that aren't even listed in the HOA regulations," I said, pointing to a few clauses she had misinterpreted. "And there are numerous guidelines that haven't been updated in years, some of them even illegal under state law." The room fell silent. I could feel Karen's confidence slipping away as I continued to expose her ignorance. The more I spoke, the more I saw her posture weaken. "You've been making up fines," I said, my voice steady and clear. "And you've been enforcing rules that don't exist. That's illegal, Karen." Her face reddened as she tried to regain control. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, clearly shaken. But it was too late. The damage was done. The other members of the HOA board were looking at her with suspicion, and I could tell that her position was no longer secure. When the meeting ended, Karen quickly dismissed herself, leaving in a hurry without saying a word to anyone. It was clear that the foundations of her power were beginning to crumble. I didn't feel victorious yet, but I had planted the seed, and Karen's grip on the neighborhood was weakening. The fight was far from over, but I was no longer the one being controlled. The board meeting had been a turning point, but Karen wasn't one to simply accept defeat. She was already scheming, looking for a way to regain control. I could feel her eyes on me whenever we crossed paths. She no longer pretended to be friendly. Instead, she watched me like a hawk, waiting for me to slip up. At first, it seemed like Karen was just going to let things cool down, but I quickly realized that she had started a campaign of whispers behind my back. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to were suddenly acting cold, casting sideways glances as I walked down the street. It wasn't long before I overheard someone gossiping at the grocery store about how uncooperative I was with the HOA. Karen was poisoning the neighborhood against me and turning people who had once been friendly into passive-aggressive strangers. It was her attempt to isolate me, and it was working. But I wasn't about to sit back and let her paint me as the troublemaker. I had a plan. It wasn't enough to just expose her mistakes anymore. I needed to take the fight directly to her. I had to play her game, but on my terms. The next step was to take advantage of her own paranoia. She was obsessed with controlling the neighborhood, so I decided to take advantage of her obsession. I began doing things on my property that, to anyone else, would seem completely innocuous. I put up some outdoor furniture on the porch just to see what would happen. I rearranged my flower beds slightly, making them a bit more colorful. I even painted the trim of my house a color that was technically in the approved palette, but was one that Karen had previously hinted wasn't appropriate. Sure enough, Karen wasted no time in showing up, clipboard in hand, ready to critique. This time, I was ready for her. She marched up to my door and gave a tight smile. "We need to talk again," she said in that patronizing tone she'd perfected. "Your porch furniture is clearly an eyesore. It doesn't match the aesthetic we've established in the neighborhood." I didn't flinch. "Oh, I'm sorry, Karen. I didn't realize my porch was such a major problem, but I'm more than happy to make changes if you feel strongly about it." She hesitated, clearly caught off guard by my compliance. "Well, that's good to hear, but we also need to discuss the flowers. I've noticed you've changed their arrangement, and it's starting to get a bit chaotic." I nodded, thoughtfully. Sure. Sure. What exactly are your concerns?" Her expression twisted as she pointed to the purple hydrangeas I had added to the mix. "These don't belong in this neighborhood. It's too bold, too bright." I let out a small chuckle. "You're worried about flowers?" "Yes," she snapped. "This is an issue, and you need to fix it." That was when I made my move. I wasn't just going to let her walk all over me anymore. "You know, Karen," I said, maintaining a calm, collected tone, "I've noticed something. You've been policing everyone's yards, everyone's homes for the tiniest infractions, and it's starting to feel a little overbearing, don't you think?" She narrowed her eyes. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I replied coolly. "I'm just pointing out that maybe you've gone a little too far. People don't like feeling like they're being watched every second, and I think you might be losing some support over it." Karen visibly bristled. She was used to getting her way, and now someone was challenging her authority. It was clear she wasn't used to it, and it was starting to eat away at her. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said through gritted teeth. "I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood nice." "By controlling everyone?" I shot back. "By making them conform to your vision of perfection? That's not how a community works, Karen. You can't make everyone bend to your will." I could see her breathing get more shallow, her hands shaking as she clutched the clipboard even tighter. But she wasn't done yet. With a forced smile, she said, "Well, I'll be taking note of this. You haven't heard the last of me." I watched as she stormed off, muttering to herself. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt something else. The weight of the real battle was just beginning. Later that evening, I sat down to reflect on the escalating tension. I had hoped that standing up to her would make Karen back off, but she wasn't going to give up her power that easily. It was clear now that I needed to be more strategic. I had to outsmart her at her own game. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Karen's control over the HOA wasn't as secure as she thought. In fact, she had made so many missteps that it was only a matter of time before her own actions would expose her. The next morning, I set my plan into motion. I began quietly talking to other neighbors, gently mentioning some of the more outlandish rules Karen had been enforcing. I wasn't trying to stir up trouble, but I wanted to see who was willing to stand up to her. Slowly, I began to realize I wasn't the only one fed up with Karen's control. Word started to spread. The tide was turning. But Karen still didn't know what was coming. She thought she had won. She thought she was in control. But I could already feel the walls closing in on her, and soon she'd have to face the consequences of her own actions. By now, Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, but she didn't realize just how much trouble she was in. While she had been busy scheming behind the scenes to reassert her authority, I had been working quietly, talking to neighbors, gathering support, and planting seeds of doubt about her leadership. It was all a slow burn, but every conversation, every subtle suggestion I made, was pushing Karen closer to the edge. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president anymore. She had turned into something more dangerous, a person desperate to maintain control at all costs. The more people pushed back against her, the more erratic and unpredictable she became. One night, just a few days after I had had that heated exchange with her about my flowers and porch furniture, I was sitting in my living room enjoying a rare moment of peace when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find two men in uniform standing there. "Good evening," one of them said. "We're here on behalf of the HOA. We've received a complaint about the noise level coming from your property. Neighbors have reported loud music, and we're required to issue a warning." I blinked, momentarily stunned. "What are you talking about? I've been inside all day. There's been no loud music." The officer seemed uncomfortable. "We're just following up on the complaint, ma'am. Can you confirm there's no noise disturbance coming from your house?" I was starting to catch on. This wasn't some random complaint. Karen had orchestrated this, trying to find anything to use against me. She was throwing accusations left and right, hoping something would stick. I smiled to myself, realizing that I was more in control than she thought. "I haven't played any music," I told the officers firmly, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd let Karen know that I'm not going to tolerate her using the HOA to target me." The officers exchanged an awkward glance, clearly unsure of how to proceed. After a long pause, they nodded and left. No ticket, no fine. It was clear that Karen had been hoping to get a fine on record, hoping that would damage my reputation further. But instead, she had just revealed her hand, and I was growing more confident by the day. But Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, she was doubling down on her efforts. The next day, as I stepped outside to grab the mail, I found an official-looking letter slipped under my door. I picked it up and read through the contents. It was an eviction notice. The HOA had decided that I was in violation of the community standards, T, and they were demanding that I remove every single decoration from my property. Everything from the mulch to the outdoor furniture to the flower beds. I was being fined, threatened with legal action, and given a short time to comply. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my cool. I had expected something like this. It wasn't enough for Karen to try to control my property. Now she was escalating, using legal intimidation tactics to force me out. But she had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated me. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. Instead, I gathered my evidence, the emails, the notes from neighbors, the official HOA records, and started building my case. Karen was about to find out that I wasn't just a homeowner she could push around. I was ready to fight back, and I was going to do it on my terms. But Karen's panic was becoming more palpable. She could sense that she was losing control. I started hearing whispers around the neighborhood about her increasingly strange behavior. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak up were now starting to question her actions. People were asking why she was so obsessed with policing trivial things. The community was starting to see through her facade, and the cracks in her authority were beginning to widen. I wasn't the only one who had been watching her every move. One evening, I was talking to a neighbor, Linda, a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years. She had been quiet until now, but after hearing about the HOA's overreach, she finally spoke up. "I don't know how you're handling this," she said, shaking her head. "Karen's been doing this for years. She gets away with it because people are scared of her. But I'm tired of it. I'm tired of hearing her tell me I'm in violation for planting some flowers too close to the sidewalk. I can't stand it anymore." It was like a domino effect. Linda's words were the spark that ignited a fire in others. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out were now rallying together, sharing their own stories of Karen's heavy-handed tactics. People were finally realizing they had more power than they thought. The HOA board was becoming aware of the growing discontent among the residents, and the cracks in Karen's reign were becoming too wide to ignore. Still, Karen kept trying to tighten her grip. She began calling emergency HOA meetings, demanding support from the board members. She accused me of corrupting the neighborhood and claimed that my actions were undermining her authority. But instead of rallying the board to her side, she only alienated them further. The HOA members were beginning to see the truth. Karen had overstepped her bounds, and they weren't happy about it. As tensions reached a boiling point, I decided it was time to take the final step. It wasn't enough to simply expose her behavior. It was time to take the battle directly to Karen's door, figuratively and literally. I started gathering all the documentation I had compiled, all the proof of her shady dealings, the unapproved fines, the illegal contracts, the manipulation of the HOA rules for personal gain. It was a mess of corruption, and I was ready to shine a light on it. But just as I was preparing for my next move, Karen made one last desperate attempt to regain control. She called a special meeting of the HOA, hoping to rally the board in her favor one last time. She was going to do whatever it took to hold on to power, and she didn't realize that this meeting would be her undoing. The special HOA meeting Karen had called was set to take place on a Wednesday evening, and I could feel the tension in the air as the day drew closer. She was bringing out the big guns now, trying to convince the board that I was some kind of troublemaker who needed to be dealt with before I could disrupt the peace of the entire neighborhood. But little did she know the tide had already turned. I had been speaking with a few of the other homeowners, and their opinions were shifting. People who had previously turned a blind eye to Karen's bullying were now beginning to see the extent of her manipulation. Neighbors who had quietly tolerated her complaints were suddenly ready to speak up. It was as if Karen's carefully constructed web of control was unraveling before her eyes, and she didn't even realize it. When the meeting finally began, I was there, sitting quietly in the back, ready to watch her make her move. Karen took her place at the head of the table, her face a mask of forced confidence. She had no idea what was coming. As expected, she wasted no time in launching into her usual tirade, accusing me of disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. She went on about my supposed violations, highlighting every minor infraction, none of which were anything more than small differences of opinion about taste and decoration. But now the board members were listening closely, and their expressions were beginning to change. One by one, Karen's accusations were met with silence, or worse, a raised eyebrow or a disapproving glance. And when she tried to justify her overreaching actions, like fining people for simply planting flowers in the wrong spot or using the wrong colors on their homes, the cracks in her argument became impossible to ignore. A neighbor named Tim, who had been quietly sitting near the back, finally spoke up. Karen, we've had enough of this. You can't keep making rules up as you go along. You're suffocating us with these petty complaints. We've been afraid to speak out, but now, enough is enough. The room fell quiet. I could see Karen's face flush with anger as the board members turned to look at Tim, and then to each other. More people were beginning to speak up now. The board members, some who had supported Karen blindly for years, were starting to question her actions. Karen, realizing she was losing her grip, tried to rally the troops. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. I'm just trying to protect the integrity of this neighborhood. It's my responsibility to keep things orderly, and you all need to realize that. But her argument was falling on deaf ears. The more she talked, the more the board members exchanged glances. They could see the truth now. Karen wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was exploiting it for her own sense of power. At this moment, I decided it was time to put the final nail in her coffin. I stood up from my seat, making sure I had everyone's attention. I could feel Karen's eyes burn into me, but I wasn't afraid anymore. It was my turn. I think it's time we address something more serious, Karen, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. You've been using your position to control this neighborhood and target people you don't like. You've been handing out fines, making up rules, and even taking money from the HOA funds. And I have proof. I could see Karen's face drain of color as I pulled out the stack of documents I had been quietly collecting. The emails, the contracts, the unapproved fines, all of it was there, ready to expose her corruption. I handed the papers to the board members, who looked them over in stunned silence. I've been documenting your actions for weeks, I continued, my voice steady. Every fine you've imposed without cause, every instance where you've misused HOA funds for your own benefit, and every time you've twisted the rules to suit your personal agenda. I have it all here. Karen stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't say a word. The room was dead silent as the board members went over the documents. The truth was undeniable. "You've been lying to us all," one of the board members finally spoke up. "Karen, this is unacceptable. We can't let you continue to run things this way." The board was officially turning against her. It was like watching the last walls of her fortress crumble in real time. She tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the murmurs of the board members as they shared their outrage. I could see Karen's mind racing. She was losing control fast, and the panic was visible in her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her, but then I remembered how she had tried to break me, how she had used every dirty trick in the book to push me around. Her reign of terror was finally coming to an end. She stammered, her hands trembling. You can't do this. I'm the president. I've worked too hard for this position. I won't let you destroy everything I've built." But her words were falling on deaf ears. The board had already made up their minds. In a final vote, Karen was ousted from her position as HOA president. Her own supporters abandoned her one by one. It was a humiliating defeat. And as she stormed out of the room, defeated and powerless, I could hardly contain my satisfaction. But the true victory came later that night, when the neighborhood came together. People who had been living in fear of Karen for years were now openly celebrating. There was laughter and music in the streets, a sense of relief spreading throughout the community. I had not only defeated Karen, I had freed the neighborhood from her tyranny. As I stood outside watching the celebrations unfold, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. I had taken a stand and it had paid off. The power had shifted, and now the neighborhood was mine. The day Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president felt like a personal victory. It wasn't just the sense of justice that flooded me, but the realization that I'd exposed her for the fraud she was and freed my neighbors from her oppressive rule. The weight that had been on my shoulders for months finally lifted, and I could breathe again. The fallout from the meeting had been swift and dramatic. Word spread like wildfire that Karen had been ousted, and soon enough the neighborhood was alive with whispers of her downfall. No one had expected it. For years, Karen had been this untouchable force, lording over the cul-de-sac with her endless rules and regulations. But now that fortress had crumbled, and people were free. I didn't just sit back and bask in the glory. No, I made sure to enjoy every moment of Karen's humiliation. Subtly, of course. The next day, when I went to check my mail, I saw her standing at the end of my driveway, her face red with fury. She was staring at me with a look of pure hatred, her hands clenched into fists. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no idea what you've done. I'm not going to let you get away with this. I will find a way to make you regret this." I calmly looked up from my mailbox and smiled sweetly. "Oh, I'm sure you'll try, Karen, but the truth is, you're not in charge anymore. You lost." Her face twisted, and for a moment I thought she might actually charge at me, but then she seemed to realize the futility of it all. She turned on her heel, stomping down the street without saying another word. Her power was gone, and she knew it. Later that day, the HOA board announced that they would be conducting a full audit of all the fines and violations Karen had imposed during her reign. The community was in an uproar, demanding refunds for the unfair fines they had paid under her leadership. I could almost hear the collective sigh of relief as people realized that they wouldn't have to live in fear of arbitrary fines anymore. The new board, which I had quietly helped to influence, began cleaning up the mess Karen had left behind. They made it clear that the days of living under her thumb were over. No more surprise fines, no more unreasonable rules, just a community that could finally breathe easy again. But the best part? Watching Karen try to rebuild her life after the collapse of her control over the neighborhood. She tried to gather support from the few remaining people who still sympathized with her, but her influence had eroded. People who had once been too intimidated to challenge her were now openly laughing at her attempts to regain control. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two neighbors in the park. They were discussing Karen's latest attempt to spread rumors about me, claiming I had somehow manipulated the HOA into removing her. Didn't she have a whole list of things she tried to fine people for? One neighbor laughed. And didn't she lose all that power because she didn't know the rules? What a mess. I couldn't help but smile. Karen had been so consumed with power that she had completely overlooked the fact that people were getting fed up. And when that tipping point came, it was like a floodgate opening. She thought she could control everything with a clipboard and a smile, but all it took was a little resistance to bring her world crashing down. The real sweet revenge came at the HOA's next community barbecue, which was being held at the park just a week after Karen's ousting. The atmosphere was light, joyful, and relaxed. Everything it hadn't been under Karen's rule. People were laughing, talking freely, and sharing stories of how they had been unfairly fined by Karen. It was a celebration of freedom. As I walked through the crowd, I spotted Karen standing off to the side, her arms crossed, watching everyone with a sour look on her face. She was alone, isolated, and it was clear she didn't belong anymore. No one wanted to associate with her, not after everything that had happened. She had been exposed, and everyone knew the truth. I walked up to her, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. "You know, Karen," I said with a small smile, "it's a shame you never learned how to actually listen to people. Instead of trying to control everyone, you could have had a lot of support, but you blew it." Her eyes blazed with fury, but she didn't say a word. She knew she couldn't fight back anymore. Her power had crumbled, and all that was left for her was the bitter reality of her defeat. The rest of the night was spent celebrating with the neighbors, and I couldn't help but laugh when I saw Karen sulking in the corner, completely ignored by everyone. She was a relic of the past now, someone who would always be remembered as the HOA tyrant who tried to control the neighborhood, but ultimately failed. As I stood there, surrounded by the people who had once lived in fear of her, I realized just how far we'd come. Karen had tried to control me, tried to tear me down, but in the end, it was her who had been brought down. And I had triumphed, not just over her, but over everything she represented. In that moment, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't just a survivor of Karen's tyranny. I was the one who had changed everything. And there was no sweeter revenge than that.